Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this evening's conversation with Professor Philippe Sands QC, author of East West Street and The Rat Line. Thank you to our partners in this event, the Association of Jewish Refugees and Michael Newman and his team who facilitated this conversation. And of course, a very warm welcome to all the members of AJR and of course the members of South Hampstead Synagogue and all others who are joining us as well. First, we're going to start with some words of welcome from Andrew Kaufman, member of South Hampstead and chairman of the AJR.
Thank you, Shlomo. I'd just like to welcome everyone to this joint event between AJR and South Hampstead. As Shlomo says, I've got a foot in both camps as chairman of AJR and as a proud member of South Hampstead Shul. Now, Philippe Sands and his family are old friends of the AJR. So we're really delighted Philippe has agreed to speak this evening, primarily about his book, The Rat Line, but also his first book, East West Street. Now, these are two of the best books I have read this century, really. And as a lawyer, to discover that the twin concepts of genocide and crimes against humanity both emanated from two Jewish lawyers, Lauterbach and Raphael Lemkin, from Lvov, Lemberg in the Ukraine, was quite amazing. Philippe will be in conversation tonight with Rabbi Shlomo Levine, who is fast acquiring the reputation as the Michael Parkinson of our shul, having interviewed such luminaries as John Sokol, Katya Adler, and Michael Heseltine over the past few months. So it's enough from me, and let me now pass you back to Shlomo.
Thank you for those kind and totally true words about Philippe and completely untrue words about me. But Philippe, just thank you so much for joining us. It's really great to meet you at last. And we've really been looking forward to this conversation. So there we are. Good evening to you. How are you?
Well, thank you, Rabbi Levine. Thank you, Shlomo.
No, it's just Shlomo. It's not Rabbi. Okay. We're allergic.
Well, Shlomo, it's really lovely to be here. As Andrew mentioned, the AJR does indeed have a very important place in my life and my family's life. We're actively involved, always wanting to support. And of course, I've been to South Hampstead on many occasions.
Great. Okay, well, tonight's conversation is not a book review. Instead, it's a conversation primarily about some of the moral issues that arise out of your books. And as some people haven't amazingly read either East West Street or The Rat Line, perhaps, Philippe, we should start with you just giving us a 3-minute précis of the period and the people that the two books cover.
I'll do my best in 3 minutes. You sound like a judge when you're appearing before a judge. You'll be told to be brief. In a nutshell, I received an invitation back in 2010 to give a lecture at the law faculty in the city of Lviv on the cases that I do as a barrister on crimes against humanity and genocide. I accepted because I wanted to find the house where my grandfather, Leon Buchholz, was born in that city in 1904. I found my grandfather's house, and I also discovered, as it was mentioned, that the inventors of the concepts of crimes against humanity and genocide came from Lviv, Lauterbach and Raphael Lemkin. And I started writing a book about the three men, the three L's, Leon, Lauterbach, Lemkin in Lviv, Lemberg, Lvov. And then came across a fourth man, Hans Frank, who had been Adolf Hitler's personal lawyer from 1928 to 1933. And then appointed in due course Governor General of Nazi-occupied Poland, based in Krakow. And he became the fourth character, if you like, in East West Street, which tells the story of the interrelationship between the four men. In the course of writing East West Street, researching it, I met the son of Hans Frank, and indeed we've become quite close, very close, Nicholas Frank, a very fine person indeed. He is a character in East West Street. Famously, when I first met him in Hamburg back in 2011, the first thing he said to me was, "Philippe, you need to understand I'm against the death penalty in all cases, except in the case of my father, who deserved to be hanged." And our relationship proceeded from that starting point. At a certain moment, he introduced me to Horst Wächter, who is the son of Otto and Charlotte Wächter. Horst is exactly the same age as Nicholas. He was born in 1939. Otto Wächter was governor of Krakow, responsible for building the ghetto, then governor of Galicia, based in Lemberg, and indicted for mass murder in 1945, the murder of hundreds of thousands of Jews and Poles. But he escaped, made his way eventually to Rome, hoping to get to South America, but died in mysterious circumstances. Along the way, Horst, who is very different from Nicholas, he is not an anti-Semite, he is not a Holocaust denier, but as he says to me, it is my duty as a son to try to find the good in my father. So he is sort of in denial about his father's actions. But at a certain point, he gave me the parents, Charlotte and Otto's, entire personal archive, letters, diaries, photo albums, everything. And the rat line tells the story of a relationship between Otto and Charlotte, which for me is fascinating because we never hear about the spouses. And so we really get an inside story. It's the story of what Otto Wächter did, and that will affect many people in on this call. So it is delicate. And then what happened when he escaped. And that really is the second half of the book. And in certain respects, as shocking, but in different ways, because what emerges, and which really stunned me, was that while he was on the run, hunted by the Americans, the British, the Poles, the Jews, the Soviets, he was also part of an effort to recruit senior Nazis. And we can talk a little bit more about that in due course. But that, in a nutshell, is the story. It's my relationship with the Franks, with the Wächters, with Lauterbach, with Lemkin.
Well, you've done that so brilliantly in your summing up. You've left me with nothing to ask you whatsoever. But I suppose one of the first amazing things, in almost an emblematic way, archetypal, is the difference between these two second generation sons, the Wächter son and the Frank son. I mean, how do you understand these differences? Is it just a matter of personality? One son who is, can sit in the courtroom where his father was convicted, to be hung and said, "This is a happy place," and the other one who just always wants to say, "My father was a good man. He was a fine person." Have you found a way to explain this?
I've stayed in touch with both of them, although you'll be interested to know that they no longer talk to each other. That is because of a single scene in a film which some of you may have seen, a BBC documentary called My Nazi Legacy, which traces the story of our relationship, where Nicholas muses that perhaps Horst is a new kind of Nazi. I actually on camera say I don't think that is the case, but as a consequence of that conversation, Horst saw that and was very upset. And that's what caused him to give all his parents' documents to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C., where they're now publicly available. You can go online, just type in Wächter, US Holocaust Memorial Museum, and you get all of the documents. And it's pretty astonishing to start working your way through them. So they don't talk to each other because of that exchange. I talk to both of them. And of course, I'm not a psychiatrist or psychologist or psychoanalyst, so it's a matter of speculation. There are plenty of differences between the two men. One is German, Nicholas. One is Austrian. I think that may play a role in the differences. There are just pure personality differences. They are different characters. Nicholas went on to become a very successful, very distinguished journalist for Stern. He was the foreign editor of Stern, whereas Horst his career never really took off in any meaningful sense. But I think the key to understanding the two of them is their families. Nicholas came from an essentially unhappy and broken family, whereas Horst came from a much happier family. And the key to understanding Horst, I think, is not his relationship with his father, but his relationship with his mother. He would often say to me, and does often say to me, I never really knew my father. I never really knew him to love him, but I loved my mother. And because my mother loved my father, I have to honor my mother and find the good in my father. I think that is the key to understanding the difference between the two men.
And yet he cannot get his head around the fact that his father was a criminal. Was my father really a criminal, he asks.
No, I mean, it's, he knows, we've been to all of these places. He knows the horrors that happen. He really does not deny any of the horrors. He doesn't deny that his father was physically present in these places. But he sort of says, my father was essentially a decent man. When he was constructing the Krakow ghetto, I mean, I'm paraphrasing here, he didn't intend to mass murder anyone. So, I'm a lawyer. I've tried to approach it in a balanced and fair way, but the evidence is overwhelming, and it's overwhelming in only one direction. His father was a rabid anti-Semite, and his father was a mass murderer. But Horst will not allow me to describe Otto Wächter, who was supported absolutely by his spouse Charlotte, to use those words in his presence. He gets very upset, and it's again to do with the relationship with the mother. He's in denial about the facts. Just today, I got an email from him saying, you missed out all the key documents in your book. I mean, I have searched and searched.
A sequel, there's going to be a sequel.
Well, no, I don't think there will be, but I think, if there were documents saying he saved 200 Jews in Lemberg, I would have put that in the book, like Archbishop Sheptytsky in Ukraine, who did actually save a lot of Jews by hiding them in his home and in his buildings. There's not an iota of anything. If anything, it points everything in the opposite direction. He wanted to kill as many Jews and Poles as he possibly could.
Well, we'll come back to some of that in a few moments, but I just want to come back to the issue of this strange phenomenon of for both Hans Frank on the one side and his family, and Wächter on the other side. There are these extraordinary documents that Hans Frank has kept a detailed document of all of his activities. In a sense, you could really say that it was used in the prosecution against him. It was literally hung by his own petard. And Charlotte Wächter has kept this wonderful personal diary, which gives us such an extraordinary insight into a dimension of family life amongst these Nazis that you don't get anywhere else.
Yes, it's very interesting you mentioned both types of documents, because of course the Frank documents are official documents, which is shocking, but because he describes in detail decisions taken, and they became 42 volumes of diaries, literally exhibit number 1 in the famous Nuremberg trial, where he was tried, convicted, sentenced to death for the murder of 4 million human beings, 3 million Jews and 1 million Poles. And imagine how that is for a son to grow up with a father who's hanged for those appalling actions. The Wächter documents, though, are private documents, and in certain respects, that makes them even more fascinating, because I've always thought that it is the private documents that reveal the true inner feelings. The public documents describe the decisions taken and what happened. The private documents describe the mental state of the people doing them. And one of the really shocking aspects of these documents is that whilst the mass murder is going on, there is ordinary daily life. And this is very complex, because it means that you see the Wächters as decent folk. They are capable of humanity, of love, of affection, whilst they are, particularly Otto, engaged in these terrible acts. But it is not just the letters and the diaries. After the war, Charlotte wrote lengthy reminiscences of what had happened, and they are extraordinary. For example, March 1938, the Anschluss in Vienna, Hitler has arrived. She describes getting her husband back from Berlin, where he has fled after he's been indicted for treason, back to Vienna. He arrives, beautiful in his SS uniform. They go and stand on the balcony overlooking the Heldenplatz. We all know those famous pictures. And she describes standing 1 meter from the Führer. It was the most extraordinary day of her life. This is her writing after the event, after the Nazis were vanquished. And then they enter the building. They walk down the large marble staircase. Some of you will have been inside that building of the Hofburg. You will know this staircase I'm talking about. And at the bottom, she describes how her dear husband, Otto, turned to her and said, "My darling, I'm back in Vienna. I have a choice. I can either continue my lucrative career as a lawyer, or I can accept the offer from Arthur Seyss-Inquart, our dear friend, and join the government. What should I do?" And at that point, they reach a crossroads. And she could have said, enough of this nonsense, stay away from the Nazis, go back to legal practice. And she doesn't. She encourages him to go the government and Nazi route. And that's very telling.
I want to explore a little bit more about the women in a few moments, because they are, they're a very important part of this whole story and this whole phenomenon, the wives of the Nazis. But I just want to come back for a moment, because across the books you've got these amazing pairs all the way through. So you've got Hans Frank and Otto Wachter, the 2 Nazis. You've got the 2 wives. You've got the 2 sons. You've got the 2 lawyers, the two prosecutors. Within each of these pairs, they're very, very different people, and yet there are some astonishing similarities. And I think the most extraordinary one that really needs to be unpacked is the similarity between Lauterbach and Hans Frank. And there's this extraordinary passage in one of your books that when Hirsch Lauterbach hears the news in 1946, as he's preparing the draft of the closing argument for the prosecution of Hans Frank in Nuremberg, and he's just heard that all of his family in Lemberg perished at the hands of the man who is prosecuting. And what helps him get through the day is listening to Johann Sebastian Bach, and in particular, the Matthew Passion. At exactly the same time, Hans Frank, sitting in prison in this trial, tells the American psychologist, Dr. Gustav Gilbert, that during the trial, he's begun to sense the enormity of the crime, and that what helps him to get through is to imagine that he's listening to the music of Johann Sebastian Bach, and in particular, the Matthew Passion. Now, how do you explain that?
Well, you couldn't invent it. You just, when I came across the documents, Lauterbach, in a letter to his son, Eli, who some of you may have known or have been taught by. Eli was my first teacher of international law. Frank's reference to the Matthäus Passion, the Matthew Passion, in the diaries of Gustav Gilbert, the American military psychologist, I was astonished. So of course I immersed myself deeply into the music to understand. And of course the music itself is very relevant to the book East-West Street. One of the things that I think is important to mention is that Lauterbach is the man who put the concept of crimes against humanity into the Nuremberg Statute and international law. And it's about the protection of individuals. The alternative legal idea is genocide, which is concerned not with the protection of individuals, but with the protection of groups. And that was Lemkin's idea, and we may, in due course,
we'll come back to that.
Yeah. But even before we get to the Matthew Passion, the idea, and I'm a practicing lawyer, I do court cases, that you would suddenly discover 2/3 of the way through a trial that the man you are prosecuting is responsible for the murder of your entire family, your mother, your father, your brother, your sister. It's impossible to comprehend how the decent human person can deal with that situation.
And Lemberg is in exactly the same situation.
Frank. I mean, Lemkin is in the same situation. He learns the same thing. Lemkin learns the same thing. But what is here is the complexity, which is very challenging. Hans Frank was a highly educated, highly cultured man. He was a lawyer. He went to the best law schools. He was personally a friend of Richard Strauss, the composer. Strauss wrote a song in his honor in 1943. How do we cope with that? And yet he is involved in these actions and these decisions. So you've got two highly cultured, highly intelligent, highly cultivated men. One goes one direction, the other goes the other direction, and they meet in court. And I often imagine what crossed their eyes.
And isn't it the fact as well, just to interrupt you for a moment, that they were both at university together, they studied law from the same professor?
No, that was Lauterbach and Wächter. Unbelievably, in 1919, Hirsch Lauterbach and Otto Wächter entered the University of Vienna Law School at exactly the same time, October 1919. Indeed, just over a year ago, October 2019, I was invited to give a lecture on that at the University of Vienna Law Faculty. It was extraordinary. I mean, literally 700-800 people crammed into the amphitheater to hear this extraordinary story of two young men coming into the law faculty on the same day. And 25 years later, one of them, Wächter, is responsible for killing the entire family of the other. In fact, it gets even worse. As you know, Shlomo, Wächter not only targets the parents of his classmates and the family of his classmates, he targets his own teachers. He is the one who writes to two of his professors at the University of Vienna Law School and removes them from their positions, strips them of their pension rights, and consigns them to their deaths. Now, again, as a university teacher, the idea that one of my students could ever do that, it's beyond imagination, and yet it happened.
Well, I wonder whether I was struck more by the similarities than by some of the differences. And I just wonder whether, in a sense, this takes us to the very core of the matter, because I know that you reject Hannah Arendt's phrase, the banality of evil, and that she coined during the trial of Eichmann, because you believe that men like Hans Frank and Otto Wächter, for them, it wasn't a matter of indifference, but active engagement. So there's nothing banal about it. But the question I ask is, are these and other Nazis like them, are they truly evil men in their essence? Or are they simply ambitious and capable men who rise through the ranks? They're swept up by the rhetoric and the madness of the times, the demagoguery of Hitler, and they'll end up doing evil things that they simply don't see at the time as being evil. Because here's Hirsch Lauterbach and Hans Frank, they're drinking from the same cultural pool. That is, they are one people. They're so similar in so many ways.
I mean, just to be very clear on the banality of evil, I'm not rejecting the characterization that some people did indeed engage in terrible crimes without really thinking about them. They went along, if you like. But in the case of Wächter and Frank, there was nothing banal about it in the sense that you say, as you say, because they knew precisely what they were doing and they voluntarily engaged in the acts. So it was a willing and knowing participation, and knowing, according to their own standards of culture, of philosophy, and of law, that it was wrong what they were doing, although neither really acknowledged it. Wächter never did. Hans Frank sort of did a little bit. And the complexity of your question is that I never describe them as monsters, because I don't think giving these two men the label of monster is adequate. They did monstrous things, terrible things, but they also did good things. They were capable of love, they were capable of affection, they were capable of generosity. So how do we square that? None of us is, if you like, labeled with a single label. We're all complex personalities. My own sense is that there's nothing in this story which shows that a particular culture or community, say Germans and Austrians, have a monopoly on engagement in these acts of horror. I've just spent a lot of time over the last few days watching and rewatching the extraordinary video by Arnold Schwarzenegger in relation to the events in the United States last week. I think a very courageous statement that he made, where he effectively says, look, I'm Austrian. I was born in 1947. I knew some of the people who are involved in these things. I know how it begins. I know how one thing leads to another. And that, I think, is the crucial lesson. I think it could happen in other places. I think there are people in our own communities who are capable of doing these kinds of things. I think in the United States, they face a particular difficulty, but I've got to say, I think we face a particular difficulty in our own country also. And certainly across Europe, we are aware of other situations which are extremely problematic.
So in a sense, it's more chilling not to describe them as monsters and as evil human beings. If a person is born evil, you know what you're dealing with. But if you're an ordinary person, I think you have a conversation with Horst's daughter Magdalena in an Italian restaurant, and you say, this of course is long after, during the course of your research, you say how decent people with good families and fine educations could become embroiled in terrible things or turn a blind eye to them. That is really chilling, isn't it? The fact that through demagoguery, through the power of words, through personality, through, you refer to the events in the States, you can see 70, 80 million people can be turned by a lie.
Yes. And it always begins with words. The words are how everything begins. The finest book to read on this, if you're interested, is by Victor Klemperer.
Yes.
The
brother of the musician.
Yes, Lingua Tertii Impera, the language of the Third Reich. He spent his time, apart from the incredible diaries that he wrote, I'm very honored right now, I'm writing a foreword to a new edition of them. He kept up a note paper of the language used in the Nazi world from 1933 onwards, and then wrote a book about it. And in fact, I was commissioned to write an article about it by a leading British newspaper, comparing the language of Johnson and of Trump to the language described by Victor Klemperer. And of course, I'm not saying they are the same. I'm certainly not saying they are Nazis, but they are prone to racist tropes. They are prone to attacking the other, which is always how it begins. And interestingly, the newspaper decided in the end not to publish the article, but it was published in 9 papers across Europe, completely unchanged. And I think in the United States and the United Kingdom, sometimes in the name of freedom of expression, there is a resistance to holding people to account for the language that they use, which I think crosses lines. With Trump, it's crystal clear, but I'm afraid it's also crystal clear with our Prime Minister.
And I think that this touches as well on these two important legal concepts which emerge from these two Jews, from Lauterbach on the one hand and from Lemkin on the other. You've explained the difference between crimes against humanity and genocide. The one is against individuals, the other is against a group. But you've also explained that it's much more difficult to bring a conviction for genocide than it is for crimes of humanity, because the bar is much higher. But it seems to me that there is this one great advantage to genocide over crimes of humanity, in that Lemkin, in the book that he writes, very carefully lays down the steps, step by step, of how genocide begins to happen. In other words, he gives us early warning signs, the signals in society of the sorts of things which people are beginning to say, beginning to do, the dehumanization, etc., attitudes towards other people that belittle them, that makes them ultimately Untermenschen, people who don't count, not real human beings, etc. And genocide, although it might be a much more difficult conviction, is a more useful tool for us in the present time, isn't it?
Well, this is very complex. I mean, essentially, crime against humanity, it focuses on the protection of the individual. And Lauterbach's thesis was we need to protect every human being from being mistreated, from persecution up to murder. But it's our qualities as individual human beings, in Lauterbach's thesis, crimes against humanity, that entitles us to protection. Lemkin's idea is, well, that's all well and good, but the reality is, if you look at history, is that human beings who are targeted are not targeted because of what they've done as individuals, but because they are members of a group. And therefore, what you need to do is protect the group in order to protect the individual. I understand that, says Lauterbach, and I can see the logic of it. But what you will do is you will replace the tyranny of the state with the tyranny of the group, and you will reinforce notions of group identity, and that will give rise to the very horrors your concept of genocide seeks to prevent. And so intellectually, I must say I am with Lauterbach, but the word genocide is plainly a much more evocative and powerful word than the somewhat technical legal term of crimes against humanity, and it has taken off. That has created a very unfortunate situation. The legal definition of genocide, as you mentioned, sets the bar very high. You have to show, prove in court, an intention to destroy a group in whole or in part. It's not enough to show simply mass killing. And proving that mental intent is extremely difficult in a court of law, whereas proving mass killing, mass persecution, mass ill treatment is much easier when you don't have to prove the mental intent. So my own solution would be to merge the two concepts, but that's not going to happen. And we're left with this problem. And the problem that's created is because of the focus on genocide. When crimes against humanity or war crimes occur, people say, oh, well, they're not very serious, so we don't need to worry about those. Let's put the focus on genocide. Incidentally, you're going to be hearing a lot about this in the news this week, because on Tuesday, there is a bill going before Parliament, which is to link new international free trade agreements with certification that countries are not engaged in genocide. But I'm a critique of this legislation precisely for the reason I've just explained. What it allows is free trade agreements with countries that do war crimes or crimes against humanity, and it somehow says that's not a problem, so we'll trade with them, but we won't trade with the génocidaires. And my question is, why the distinction between the two?
Right, okay. I just want to come back to the wives for a moment, these fascinating women. I mean, the story between Charlotte and Otto Wachters, in a sense, it's a love story. She's unbelievably faithful to her husband. She supports him throughout all the years when he's running away. She's sending him ironed shirts and new clothes and doing unbelievable stuff. And throughout all the years, even after 28 years afterwards, she talks about him as being, you know, wonderful, kind, good man. He never have a quotation from her somewhere here if I can find it, but she says such extraordinary things about her wonderful, wonderful husband, etc. And you know, the question is, who are these women? You know, how, in what way they're complicit? There's this extraordinary story, you know, that she writes that, she writes on the 28th anniversary of her death. He always took pleasure in doing what he thought was the right thing to do. He only became ill when he had to do things as a soldier, a governor, as the highest functionary in charge of a country, Poland, things that he had to do without wanting to do them. Until the very end, he refused to compromise his conscience, but sometimes he just couldn't do what he thought right.
Total rubbish. Total rubbish. I mean, she's starry-eyed about him. We can trace, it's unbelievable. He writes letters to her. You know, the letters are unbelievable. I mean, December 1939, my darling, I've just been appointed governor of Krakow. She's back in Vienna. It's wonderful. Chirac has been. The Vienna Philharmonic has come to perform in Krakow. A little bit of local trouble. And tomorrow I have to have 50 Poles shot. 1942. He's in Lemberg. She's in Zell am See in the expropriated summer house with the children. My darling, it's wonderful here. I miss you. A little bit of local difficulties. And because all of the Jews have been deported, there's no one to put powder on the tennis court. Okay, I mean, it's shocking. It's an absolute shocker to read.
And yet
she's completely complicit. She's absolutely complicit in the whole thing. She knows everything that's going on. She goes to the ghetto and she takes photographs in the ghetto. And they're in the photo albums. You can go, they're in the book. I mean, it's shocking stuff.
Are beautiful. The design of the walls is so elegant.
Well, that comes from a novel. It's quite interesting, by an Italian journalist called Curzio Malaparte. The book is called Caput, but actually it was taken from his own visits to Krakow, and he describes visiting the ghetto in Warsaw and in Krakow with the Franks and with the Wächters, and standing outside the Krakow ghetto, Charlotte is quoted by him in the novel, but I suspect she said it. Look at the walls, beautiful Oriental design. What do the Jews have to worry about? So it's really shocking stuff.
Yes,
but it needed to be put in the book.
I think this one passage is the one that really just puzzles me enormously. She's in Thumersbach, taking a holiday in the mountains. Her husband is back in Krakow. She writes that she's attended the Salzburg Festival. She's attended a day of poetry. She's been to Mozart's Marriage of Figaro. She's seen Much Ado About Nothing, Bruckner's Seventh Symphony, which is her favorite piece of music. She's then taken some hikes to the remote Schmittenhoch. I don't know how to pronounce it, but she lunched by a pond. She swam and she lay naked as babies in the splendid sunshine. And then she writes, and I felt overwhelmed by the grandeur of nature. Thank you, thank you, thank you, she wrote 1,000 times from the bottom of my heart for making possible our unspeakably beautiful home.
No, I mean, this is August 1945.
And as she's talking about this, the Grosse Aktion, under the direction of her husband, is reaching its conclusion in Lemberg. This is a parallel universe.
It's a completely parallel universe, and it's a parallel universe, and it's one that is covered in silence in many families. Wächter disappears. He tries to escape South America. He gets to the Vatican. He's helped by a bishop. He's helped by others, and then dies in mysterious circumstances. And the family has spent essentially 75 years covering things up. Then along comes Muggins here, writes a book about it, writes an article about it, makes a film about it, and whoa, all of a sudden the Wächter name's back in the spotlight. So on Christmas Day, I get an extraordinary letter. You may remember, Shlomo, in the Ratline book, early on, there is a description of a man called Robert Winterstein. Robert Winterstein was the Procurator General in Austria and a very distinguished lawyer. He is removed from office in May 1938 by Wächter. I have the letter which Wächter writes to him saying, you're fired, you got no pension, and he is arrested on Kristallnacht and deported to Buchenwald, from where he does not return. On Christmas Day, I get a letter from a historian in Vienna. Dear Professor Sands, I've been given a copy of the German edition of the Ratline, Die Rattenlinie, which has just been published. I was astonished to find a reference to my great-grandfather, Robert Winterstein, in the book. And amazingly, we have in the family the letter that you refer to, but we could never decipher the signature. So we never knew who the writer of the letter to my great-grandfather was. Thanks to your book, I now know it is Otto Wächter, but I'm not writing to you about that. Here is what I'm really writing to you about. My next door neighbor and my best friend is Otto Wächter's granddaughter. What do I do about this?
Oh.
Okay, so, it goes on and on and on, these incredible stories.
But in a sense, I think this brings me to the question, the one question which I really wanted to ask, because for you, this whole odyssey began because you needed to find out what happened to your maternal grandfather's family, and who all lived in Lemberg or around there. And you discover, of course, that ultimately they are killed at the hands of these two men, Hans Frank and Otto Wächter. And here you are, the grandson, of that man, and his whole family has been destroyed. And you are good friends with the sons of these two men, one of whom you admire more than the other, it has to be said. But you have a relationship they have a kind of relationship with you, particularly Horst Wachter, who just can't let go. He's like a dog with a bone. He's got to keep writing to you. He can't let go. He's got to try and explain why his father is really a good man and how he got it all wrong. But I just wonder, Philippe, you've been almost, I suppose, obsessive in the forensic detail with which you've tracked down this whole story. The amount of research, the people that you've had involved in this, poring over pieces of paper. You've traveled around the world to interview the major and the bit part players. How has this changed you?
So the whole exercise is, of course, really, in a sense, about my grandfather. I wanted to know who my grandfather was. It's an exercise in identity. I wanted to know better who my beloved, wonderful grandfather was, because, as I'm sure for many people on this conversation tonight, it was shrouded in silence. I think as a protective instinct, as a generous, protective, loving instinct, he didn't want to subject his child, his grandchildren, to what he had been through. And so it was shrouded in silence. And I think one of the things that I've learned also from my cases, but also personally, is that it's very difficult for the next generation, the children of people who've been on the receiving end, some of whom themselves, like my mother, have been on the receiving end herself, to really open these doors. But the next generation, the grandchildren, I think can. We have the distance from it and the ability. And of course, I'm equipped with legal skills. Lawyers perhaps aren't good for so much, but we know how to find things, we know how to find facts, we know how to use archives, we know how to do all these kinds of things. And in court, it has to be said, I see some pretty horrible things. And so I'm steeled, I'm protected, I have a protective mechanism to do all of this. But essentially, the whole thing is about knowing who my grandfather was, because it's a way of knowing who I am. To understand who my grandfather was, who his mother was, who his sisters were, who were all the cousins and the uncles and the aunts, is to know from whence I came and who I am. So the impact on me, I think, has been to ground me. I'm very connected to that region. It's a dark region in many respects, but I feel connected to it, and I feel the gaps have been filled out in a way that has been positive for me. I feel I'm in a, I already had a great life 10 years ago, but I've got an even better life now because I have a sense of myself. And of course, and this comes back to something we talked about earlier, I've come out intellectually on the side of Lauterbach, but instinctually, emotionally, spiritually, I've come out, I think, on the side of Lemkin. And that comes out right at the end of East-West Street, when I find the mass grave where my grandfather's family and the Lauterbach, Hirsch Lauterbach's family, happened to be, located still today, 3,500 people killed on a single day on the 25th of March, 1943, in an unmarked mass grave. And standing at that mass grave, it was impossible not to have a sense of connection, of kinship with those people who were there because they happened to be part of the wrong community at the wrong time in the wrong place, because they were Jews. And that's been very profound for me, because it's impossible for me to have gone through that experience and not feel a connection with those people.
What do you want to tell your children as a result of this story? What do you want to tell them about their Jewishness?
Well, I think my children are, well, they're wonderful. They're completely wonderful. But they are, after 10 years, very supportive, sick to death of, honestly, Dad, what are you going to do next? Honestly, haven't you had enough? The film, the podcast, the books, that just goes on and on and on. They are the most fantastic kids in the whole world. But they're very connected with it. They're interested in it. They are, the first trip we ever took in 2010, when I went to Lviv for the first time, my mum came, my aunt came, and my son came, Leo, who's now 25. And I think it was very important for him. And then when I first got to know Horst, I wanted to do something with our older daughter. And so I went with her to Vienna. And it was very interesting. I remember going to pick her up at the airport, and I said, what do you want to do? What do you want to do? And she'd been studying history at school. And she was, 15 or something. She said, I want to go to the Museum of the Anschluss. Of course, there is no Museum of the Anschluss. It just passes in silence. There's no such place. It's astonishing. Still today, there is no such place. And then with our third child, our youngest daughter, our second daughter and youngest daughter, as you know from the rat line, I had one of the greatest experiences of my life, I would say, which is that we followed in the paths of Otto Wächter and we walked across the Dolomites. We found the route he had taken to escape. We did it last summer, in summer of 2019, so a summer and a half ago, 2 summers ago. And to do that with your own child is an extraordinary experience. And I think they're very connected to these stories, being 25, 23 and 20, they've got their own ways of engaging with it. It's normal. They've got their own interests, which are different from my interests, but it's plainly there. It's part of their being. And you know what they have that I don't have? They know about their family's hinterland. I didn't know that when I was that age. I didn't know the story. And I think knowing the story at that younger age changes you in a profound way. And it's a universal story. There'll be many people on this call for whom this is the same story, but it's universal in another sense. It's universal in the sense of the atrocities that take place in other parts of the world, not involving Poles and Jews and Ukrainians and Germans. Mass killing has points of commonality. And in part, it's the letters that I get from Cambodia, for example, saying, your book helped me to understand things about our own situation. There is a universal human connection in these issues, the individual and the group. And I think as a family, I think it's been a really good thing. And I think it's been, there's another way of looking at it. I loved my grandfather deeply. He was a hugely influential figure for me, actually a very, very religious man. And I think that what this project has done, it's enabled me to take him out of a space in which he bears the label victim to one in which he bears the label man of dignity. And that is important. It's the silver lining that comes out of this terrible period that the AJR was created as a consequence of, but nevertheless, there is a silver lining that came out of it. And that silver lining is people like Lauterbach and Lemkin, who changed the world by creating new rules which said, okay, this has to stop, or at least there have to be rules which say you can't do this. And to be part of that, I think, for all of those who were victims of those terrible, terrible years, that is something that came out of it. It doesn't justify it. It's not a replacement for it, obviously. But nevertheless, a lot of people who've been in touch with me have been profoundly affected by the idea that the loss of life, which is appalling on any count imaginable, nevertheless produced something which was significant. And I think that changes the way we think about the people who went through that experience.
And there's another point to be made, but I'll hold it for a moment because I think we should take some questions now from a very large audience. And anybody who would like to ask a question, all you need to do is unmute and speak, and we'll try to find you and spotlight you for the moment. There are also some chats, maybe some questions there that if you take a look at the chats, Philippe, you might want to answer.
I'll just say,
Philippe, can I?
Yeah, sure, please. Yeah.
So you represent obviously modern cases of genocide and acts against humanity, and I'm just wondering if you notice the difference between acts which are not on the same scale in other, are those people, do they have a bit more humanity? Do they have more regret than the Nazis who did it on such a vast scale?
No, I mean, I'm very careful to avoid sort of league tables of horror, because I think when you've been on the receiving end of horror, whether it's a community of 1,000 or a community of 1 million or a community of 6 million, for those people, it's the worst thing that's ever happened. And one has to be very, very respectful of that. But there are real points of commonality. And I think that what we will get in about 25 years or 30 years is a literature, for example, emerging out of the Yugoslav conflict or out of the Rwandan conflict, which will mirror. You know, in the case of the Holocaust, a lot of people, and I don't need to tell a lot of people who are on the call this, they will know that from 45 till about the late 80s, no one wanted to talk about this. No one really wrote about it. No one wanted to engage in it. It was just shrouded in silence. And then things began to change as new generations emerged. And that's exactly the same with Yugoslavia and with Rwanda and with Argentina and with Chile and with Kosovo and with Cambodia. So the letter that I get from Cambodia or from South Africa or from Mexico or from Argentina or from Chile, it's absolutely familiar to me because it's exactly the same kinds of stories.
Cheryl Lee has followed all the protocols and raised her hand. So Cheryl, off you go.
Gentlemen, thank you so much for your expertise. I want to ask you something, and it sounds very naive, but I don't really know how else to put it. To hold people accountable for what they did, of course, they deserve what came to them. My question is, could we honestly say, hand on heart, that we would be brave enough? I know there's a big difference between pushing someone into a chamber, but would we be brave enough to actually try and stop someone else from doing it? And I know I know the story, you know, the fact that there was a recession and Wall Street crash and all of that. I just wonder that the horror that I have for the people that perpetrated these terrible, terrible crimes. But I also wonder if I would be brave enough to put myself, my family on the line in order to save strangers or even people that I know.
Cheryl, it's a really huge question. And I ask myself frequently, what would I have done? You know, and I have to put my hand on my heart and say, I don't know. I hope I would do the right thing, but I don't know what I would have done. I think a lot about the groups in the Judenrat, the committees of Jews who would sometimes be in a ghetto, asked to give over names, knowing that the names they gave would be people who would be consigned to their deaths, but who did it hoping that if they gave a few names, they would save more. And some of those people who are on the Judenrat have, of course, been highly criticized for doing what they did. And I think that one of the things that I've tried to do in this book is never to judge on the basis of what I would have done, because I don't know what I would have done. I hope I would do the right thing, but do you really, really know what you would do? And it comes back to the question that Shlomo asked earlier, are they monsters? Actually, I don't think they did monstrous things. They did criminal things, terrible things. But it's inaccurate to describe them only as monsters and evil men, because they were part of a system. They had spouses, they had fathers, they had children, they had daily life. Shlomo's read out some of the letters. And, we too are faced with situations not akin to that level of horror, but, in terms of our treatments of refugees, in terms of on lesser levels of a scale, what do we actually do about it? It's terrible, we complain, we might write a letter, but what do we actually do about it? And I think before I criticize anyone, I ask myself the question, what would I do? And the decisions that human beings take, either as victims or as perpetrators in extremis, are overwhelmingly huge. And I think the question you've asked is a very, very important question.
Philippe, you remind me of the saying that if you point a finger at someone, there are three fingers pointing back at you.
Yeah.
Harold.
Yes, Philip, I've read both of your books and I couldn't put them down. So my next question is, what is your next project?
Well, I've got two. I mean, this will be a trilogy. So there is a third book that is coming, which involves one of the minor characters in the Rat Line. Just as Wächter was a sort of minor character in East West Street, there's a dreadful minor character in the Rat Line called Walter Rauff. And Walter Rauff was the inventor of the mobile gas chamber, and he was a comrade of Wächter's. And they occupied the same room in the monk's cell, the monastery in Rome, where Wächter was hidden. Rauff escaped to Syria in 1950 and then made his way to South America, first to Ecuador and then to Chile. And then in 1973, it is said he started working with the regime of Augusto Pinochet. And I became involved in the 1998 case concerning the arrest of Augusto Pinochet for crimes against humanity and genocide. So the third book will tell the story of Walter Rauff and the Pinochet case in the English courts. But that won't come out till 2024. And I've got a smaller book that's coming out in 2022, which tells actually a rather terrible British story, which most of you will not even have heard of. A place called Chagos, Diego Garcia, a small set of islands in the Indian Ocean, which was a British colony, part of Mauritius. And between 1965 and 1973, the British removed the entire population, scattered them to the ends of the earth, and gave the island of Diego Garcia to the Americans as a military base. Some of the people, many of the people who were removed want to go back. And I've been working for 10 years with the government of Mauritius and with them. And last year we got a decision of the International Court of Justice saying they had the right to go back. They had been removed unlawfully. This was colonialism. It was unlawful. And the government, this government, has stuck two fingers up to the International Court of Justice. And I'm telling that story, which is, I'm very sorry to say, a crime against humanity. And it comes back to Cheryl's last question. Just to put, again, I'm very careful not to make party political points here. It was a Labour government that implemented the Chagos policy, and it's a Conservative government that has proceeded with it. But I have to say, listening to our esteemed Foreign Secretary right now point the finger of blame at China in relation to its appalling treatment of the Uyghur community is really unsettling, because it is his decision not to allow the Chagossians to return to their homelands in the face of a decision of the International Court of Justice. And that is, in my view, a crime against humanity. So, you know, I will absolutely be part of the effort to bring justice to the Uyghurs, but I'm not going to take it from a foreign secretary who is perpetrating his own crimes, which he could sort out tomorrow if he wanted to do so. So these issues are complex, and they inspire, as you will have picked up, rather strong feelings.
Okay, we're going to take...
What about double standards?
We have three hands up, Roy and Mike and Brian. So let's take their questions before we bring this to a close. Roy, let's go for it. Roy first, and then Mike, and then Brian.
Hi, Roy.
Hi. How do you, does your work brought you in contact with Holocaust deniers? And if so, how do you deal with such people and their issues?
Yeah, I mean, I do come across them, and I do come across, you know, more than a few anti-Semites. If you've seen the film My Nazi Legacy, the BBC documentary, you will have seen me and Horst and Nicholas in Ukraine in a field with hundreds of people celebrating the Waffen-SS Galicia division, dressed in Waffen-SS uniforms. It was a very shocking day, but what I choose to do is go in and engage, and that is how I go about dealing with it. There is, as we know, a major rise in anti-Semitic expression in many countries of the world. Many of you will have watched what happened last week in the United States with horror. It is a small group, but it's a virulent group, and they are anti-Semites and they are Holocaust deniers. And yes, I do come across all of that. I would not have engaged with Horst if I thought he was in either of those categories. He very plainly is not. And so I can, eat with him and go to his house, and because he feels terrible about what has happened. But yes,
But Nicholas doesn't agree with you. Mike? You need to unmute. We can't hear you yet, Mike. You're still okay?
Yeah, I wanted to just slightly challenge the notion that
good, great.
If you spread the I'm using the word diagnosis, being a doctor, the diagnosis of genocide or crimes against humanity to include, let's say, those islands regarding the relocation of the population, I don't think it's fair that you can be part of a government that's not really wanting to address that and not be appalled by what's going on in China, which is a whole different order of magnitude of planned suppression of a whole population. Never mind the Holocaust, which is another few orders of magnitude beyond that. So I think there may be a danger in saying, well, you're all just in the same. And
No. I've been very, very careful what I've said. I'm not saying it's the same thing at all. What I'm saying is that if you're going to point the finger at others and lecture them on their behavior, you've got to get your own house in order. And I would challenge you. I would invite you to spend 10 minutes with Lisby Elise, aged 69, who was removed from her home by the British in 1973 with her entire family and deported forcibly, and now has an International Court of Justice judgment saying that was unlawful and that she's entitled to go back. And the British government saying, well, we're not going to honor it. We're not going to give effect to it. We're very sorry about what happened, but we're not going to do anything about it. Forcible removal, whether you're talking about, in this case, 2,500 people, which is a lot of human beings, okay, is a crime against humanity under the statute of the International Criminal Court. Now, I'm not saying it's Nazism, it's not. I'm not saying it's genocide, it's not, but it's wrong. And he is the Foreign Secretary who is making that happen. And he has to take his responsibilities. Watch very, very carefully. He's obviously embarrassed about it because he doesn't use the expression crimes against humanity.
No. Okay, let's move on to Brian and hear your final point, Brian.
Well, it really just harks back to Cheryl's point, which I think is very important, actually. I don't know if David Katz is in on this call or not, but David and I were founder members of the Foundation for the Care of Victims of Torture, which started in about 1982-3 with Helen Bamber and all of that. And we had a very clear position on what torture was, and we were providing evidence for the government at the end of the day about people who had been tortured, and we were providing the clinical evidence. And it was quite clear to us that, when you hear the same stories coming from the same places multiple times over a number of years, you just know the stories are true. And we're talking about Iran, we're talking about Uruguay, we're talking about Pinochet's Chile, and various African banana republics, essentially. Now, about the same time, there was some rather horrifying film came to light of a group of soldiers who apprehended on a hill outside of Jerusalem some purported Arab terrorists, and they stood there and broke his arm in order to extract a confession. And I then was faced with asking the very difficult question, what would I have done if I had believed that my family were at risk? And this, I'm speaking now as someone who has taken a human rights stance against torture. All right, what would I have done if I had believed those people were on the way to bomb my family? And I'm not sure. The answer is I'm not sure. Even having been steeped in all this stuff for several years, I'm not sure which side I would have come out against. And what I'm saying is one has to be extremely careful before allocating blame in these circumstances. And as Philippe has pointed out, none of us know what we would actually do confronted with the situation. And I suspect that a large part of what we would do depends on how much we were bound up with the, with the prevailing ideology.
I think I've thought about this question a lot because I'd written a book a few years ago on the use of waterboarding at Guantanamo or on the path to Guantanamo and other places. And again, it comes back to what I said earlier. I don't know what I would do either in certain circumstances. You know, the example is given of you can extract information from someone by using torture in relation to the well-being of your own children. And there is a case at the European Court of Human Rights where a German police officer in peacetime did that. He used torture in order to obtain information about the whereabouts of a child hostage where it was reasonably thought that child hostage's life was at serious and imminent risk. And in those circumstances, the police officer said, I don't care. I'm just going to do the necessary to get this information to save the life of the child. And I think many of us would do the same thing. But he did it in the knowledge that he was committing a crime. And that, I think, is the answer to it. The act of doing it doesn't make it lawful. It remains a crime. And in your sentencing, I suspect, there would be a mitigation in relation to the circumstances. But I'm very, very clear that what you can't do is begin to allow these acts in the name of some higher good, because you then open the floodgates.
Absolutely.
So
yeah.
that's how I would approach that very real and complex issue. But I accept entirely that reasonable people disagree, and there are a range of views that one could have on that situation.
Okay, I want to bring our session to a close because there are so many issues over here, and there's so much ambiguity in so many issues in some of these matters. There's no black and white, suddenly becomes terribly gray, and it's very hard to work your way through it. And that, of course, is part of the moral dilemmas that we struggle with as human beings as we try to create better society. But Philippe, I just wanted to share with you a thought. I asked you the question, what has this journey done for you in terms of your identity, etc. I, of course, I've only read the books. I haven't been on the journey the same as you have, but I wanted to just share with you an observation of what I found from these two books. Sometimes one is greatly puzzled about God and the way in which he's chosen to run his world. Much of that puzzle is around the time of the Holocaust, etc. There's so many questions which are asked. And it's as if one is unable to see the answers. You just don't know where the answers lie. And then you pick up these two books of yours, which begin to unravel a whole series of connections, a web of interconnectedness, generational interconnectedness, human interconnectedness. Most of these people we're talking about are all born around the year 1900. It's extraordinary. Everybody is kind of connected one with the other. And the way in which the stories emerge, the way in which the prosecutors begin to discover that they are actually prosecuting the people who murdered their families, the way in which the children begin to make the connection, the way in which you begin to connect your own family to this. For me, it was like it's like lifting the edge of the veil and having a little peek at the hand of God at work. It doesn't give all the answers, but you see a design. You see that there's something happening over here which is beyond coincidence. And that instills in me a feeling of a deeper sense, not just of Jewish connectedness, but actually of religious awe.
Well, it's a very wise observation, if I may say, and very connected to some of the questions that I have. One of the questions I ask myself is, how did this fall into my lap? How did it come to me to uncover these points of connection. And one of the most extraordinary points of connection is my relationship with the Lauterbachs. The fact that my first teacher of international law was Elie Lauterbach, the only child of Hirsch Lauterbach. The fact that he gave me my first job in 1984 as a research fellow in Cambridge, teaching international law, doing research on international law. Elie and I had met in 1982. And it was only in 2014 that I discovered that his father Hirsch and my great-grandmother, Amalia Flaschner, Malka Flaschner, not only came from the same region, not only came from the same province of District Galicia, but not only came from the same small town, population 5,000, but actually came from the very same street, East-West Street, Lembergerstrasse. Now, how do you explain that? It may be you have the answer in the words that you've just articulated. It may be that the psychoanalyst with whom I begin the book, Nicholas Abraham and Maria Torok, that we are haunted by the secrets of others and we find ways to communicate. But the question that I ask myself is, what was it in my relationship with Elie Lauterbach that allowed that to happen? And is it just coincidence that you could connect two human beings in Cambridge in 1982 to the same street in Żółkiew, East-West Street? Is that a coincidence, or is there some other force at play? I don't have an answer to that question, but I wonder about it a lot.
The finger of God.
The finger of something or something. Something is at play.
It's been a really fascinating conversation. Thank you so much, Philippe. We could have gone on for hours. There's so much to talk about. It's really been just absolutely a delight and a delight and a puzzle, because there's so much to try and unravel that is so mysterious, so difficult to understand, such difficult times, and particularly for many of the people who have been so kind to spend this last hour with us, who have families, either themselves or families, AJR, for whom this is personal. This is not just history, and it's not just identity. It's about their families, about themselves. We look to the past. We understand who we are in the present, but most importantly, we look to the future. And before we leave, I just wanted to mention that we have on the 24th, Sunday the 24th, Holocaust Memorial Day, and we have a really wonderful program which will be hosted by Rabbi Eli Levine. Here it is. It is, as you can see, a program on Jews and Blacks. And it's going to be Dr. James Smith, CBE, who of course is well known, and he'll be interviewing and talking to people from across the world, so please do join us for that as well. But for the moment and for tonight, thank you all for joining us. And Philippe, until the next time, we look forward.